Hey guys, Bushcraft412 here, and today I want to do a video, and this one's going to be a long one, so bear with me. Now, the purpose of this video is I kind of want to discuss the contributing factors to an SHTF scenario. I'm not saying, I don't want to do a video on what could happen, but instead why it can happen. You know, I can sit here all day long and say, well, there's going to be a war, or a terrorist attack, or a meteor's going to hit Earth, or zombies, or a plague, or whatever. I can say that all day long. And there's no real fact or basis to really, you know, like kind of warrant this stuff. And so, this is a talking video, so I put some nice stuff out here on the table for you to look at while I'm talking. And I want to talk about these contributing factors. And these are the things that will make SHTF happen. You know, not what's going to happen, but what's going to make it happen, what's going to aid it, what's going to make it worse. And I got some notes here, so hopefully I'm going to try and keep this organized and keep the time pretty short. First on my list is urbanization. A good portion of America lives in cities right now, and an even greater portion lives in suburbs. We have a large, I'd say, I don't know the exact figures, I probably should have looked them up, but a majority of our population lives in urban or suburban neighborhoods. Now, these neighborhoods are completely unsustainable in an SHTF scenario. They don't have adequate food, they don't have adequate water, they don't have adequate supplies for people to live a sustainable life. So in an SHTF scenario, you're going to have basically a mass exodus of refugees who are coming from these urban and suburban areas because they can't sustain themselves. They've just overpopulated and overgrown, and the land and the resources around them just are not capable of providing for them. And that's a big part of what's going to help make an SHTF scenario happen. A huge hurricane happens in the middle of nowhere where hardly anyone lives. Traffic isn't going to be a problem. You have a huge hurricane in a major city, you now have traffic and people trying to evacuate. You know, urbanization can be a major factor to an SHTF scenario. Moving on, number 2, which is kind of closely related, is we have an absolutely archaic infrastructure in this country. Our roads, our power grid is so outdated, it's like a third world country. I mean, if you look at it, most cities' sewer systems are based out of the 1920s and 1930s. They're brick, they overflow, they're not adequate. And in a scenario where you may have a disaster of who knows what type, there could be things like flooding and disease and things like that. And we just don't have adequate sewer systems. We don't have adequate power supplies. Geez, look at the blackouts from, was it 2002, 2003, the Northeast blackout. How easy our grid can go down because we have this archaic system. It's really unfortunate, but even our roads. Look at construction. If you live in America, you know our roads are under construction nonstop. Why? We use the cheapest, we use the cheapest labor we can. They bid, the cheapest bidder gets the job. They build roads so that they last 1 to 2 years. And in this SHTF scenario, our roads are going to be major choke points and are going to be something that's really going to keep us from, solving the problem. Our roads are not meant to take natural disasters. They're not hardened against flooding and earthquakes and hurricanes and tornadoes and all that stuff. They're a weak point. And like with everything else, our electrical system, my God, we run wires from sticks that we put in the ground. That is not in any way, shape, or form resistant to disasters. And our infrastructure is just a time bomb for an SHTF scenario. Because we haven't updated, we're not updating. We're living the same way we were 50, 60 years ago when it comes to our roads, our power, and things like that. And it's kind of scary because those are the things we need to get supplies, to get goods, to get food to places that may need to go. So, between that, urbanization and our poor infrastructure, put those two together, it's a recipe for disaster. Number 3, Well, I'm sorry, I got a little bit of a cold here, so if I'm sniffly, bear with me. agriculture, and particularly American agriculture. If you look at how we do things now, and I'm not talking 30, 40 years ago, nowadays most farms in America are monoculture farms, meaning they grow one item and one item only. They use tractors, mechanical devices. It's no longer large groups working on farms. It's very few people using machines to run farms. And in an SHTF scenario, where we may not have power, where we may not have transportation, where we may not have cars that work, our agriculture is going to backfire on us. Our agriculture is 100% dependent on oil to transport food. Most food travels 1,500 miles to get to your plate. I mean, that's a scary fact when you consider you may have a disaster that stops gas from getting to the farms. They can't harvest the food can't make it to you, and then on top of that, most of these, big monoculture farms use petroleum-based products to fertilize the ground because that kind of farming is not sustainable. I mean, it just can't continue without technology. And that's scary, especially when we have such large urban populations that need food, and to know that that source of that food is so far away, and that food is so dependent on resources like oil and gas. Very scary. Which pushes us right into our next point, oil dependency. In America, we are completely dependent on foreign oil, and I'm not doing this to start a debate or an argument in the comments, but we are completely dependent. Yes, we have our own. We have lots of stockpiles. We have the strategic reserve. We have all that. But in reality, in an SHTF scenario, here in New York, how are we going to get oil from Alaska to New York? It's not going to happen. Especially a big nationwide, massive SHTF scenario. We can't even get to our own oil. We can't get that oil to our refineries, and from our refineries to our gas tanks. Our infrastructure is too poor. If it falls, we lose oil, and and when we're dependent on foreign oil, that's just an SHTF scenario on itself. If we ever get cut off for whatever reason, we're in big trouble. And not to mention our agriculture is dependent on oil. Very scary. All right, next point. We have a completely ineffective government. And I'm not just talking the federal government, I'm talking local. I mean, our government is just inundated with red tape and bureaucracy and crazy stuff. And, Hurricane Katrina shows that when we need the government, they may not be there for us. And to top that off, our government, their response to a disaster relies on the infrastructure. They need the roads, they need the helicopters, they need the gas in order to respond to these things. They need communications, they need people, they need everything. And without that stuff, they're not going to be able to respond to disasters. So we have a government that plans for disasters that, as we saw in Hurricane Katrina, they can't even fix because, the infrastructure down south was so destroyed they couldn't get supplies in. They couldn't get past the roads. They couldn't, they were lifting people out with helicopters. They couldn't even get into the area. So our government, completely ineffective. Number 6 on my list, we have a complete and total lack of first responders in this country. And I'm not knocking them. Our first responders are the bravest and some of the most wonderful people in this country. And what they do is so underestimated. But we do not have enough. Most police departments and fire departments are facing cutbacks in the bad economy. They barely have enough to deal with the problems they have now, let alone emergencies, let alone a nationwide emergency. What's an emergency responder? 1 out of 100 people, maybe? 1 out of 200? That's not enough for a major disaster. We just don't have enough. We don't have enough equipment. We don't have enough supplies. We don't have enough to help our population in a major event. Yes, localized, no problem, because we can bring in people from other areas. We can bring in helicopters. We can bring in all kinds of stuff. But like Hurricane Katrina, we couldn't get supplies to people. Our first responders were completely crippled by our infrastructure. We didn't have roads. We didn't have communications. And And it's scary. I mean, this country really needs to look at our first responders and address that. You know, we didn't learn from Hurricane Katrina. Yeah, we made more policies, we wrote more papers, and, you know, we blamed people for it, and we pointed fingers at each other, but we didn't change anything. Nothing has changed since Hurricane Katrina. And that's scary. Next on my list, we have a completely unprepared population. We are 100% technologically dependent. We are not capable of taking care of ourselves. Most people, you know, we have so many people who are in need of health care. We have people who are in need of supervision, and by that I mean the mentally ill, the handicapped, anyone like that who may need assistance. We have a population that's not capable of taking care of itself. And then our population that is healthy, you know, most of them don't have the skills or the information to live any kind of sustainable lifestyle. We have, you know, most of our population is urban and suburban and knows nothing about farming or manufacturing or making anything or doing anything useful. I mean, I'm sorry, but we're a population of people who sit on our iPhones and play video games and watch TV. We are completely unprepared. Next on my list, globalization. And by this, I mean, we literally don't make anything in America anymore. In an SHTF scenario, something big happens, the national grid goes down, we're on our own. Who makes shirts in America? Who makes shoes in America? Who makes any of that stuff in America? Nobody. We import so much of what we use. And granted, we do supply a lot of our own food, which is awesome. But tell me one company that makes shoes in America. Tell me one company that makes t-shirts in America. I don't know of any. I mean, and even if there are a couple, they're not making enough to supply a population. And that's just one little example. You know, I mean, look at all these other things, you know. Most of the refineries in this country are jammed into, you know, the Gulf Coast in that area, around the coastlines. You know, we have globalized and we have moved so far away from the local to the global that in this kind of a scenario, the local, you know, those rural areas that are cut off are really going to be cut off. And, you know, you look at all that stuff and, you know, like people say, Walmart is just one big warehouse for China. You know, all these things we depend on for our daily living. We import so much of our stuff and we don't manufacture it anymore. And if there ever is a scenario where, you know, whatever, you know, we can't get to these things that we get globally, we're going to have to start producing them locally. And how are we going to produce them locally when our infrastructure is toast? We don't have any communication. We don't have anything going on. You know, we're not going to be able to. Who's going to make this stuff? Who's going to make first aid supplies? Who's going to make medicines? Most of our medicines are made overseas. I mean, we're really in big trouble if a major event happens. And my last point is we have a complete and total lack of local resources. If you look where you live, and for example, I live in New York, we use hydroelectric power. Okay, so say if in my area we lose the hydroelectric plants due to a disaster, where do we get our power? Well, from the national grid. Well, what if the national grid's down? We have no other way to manufacture electricity. We have no local deposits of coal, no local deposits of oil. We don't have natural resources in my area. We have natural gas. Okay, that's pretty awesome. But we don't have the resources necessary for transportation, for construction, for building. We don't have iron. We don't have copper and silver and gold. We don't have any of that around here. You know, our local resources are tapped. You know, we have fresh water. Yay, you know, okay. We've got ground, you know, but, you know, we've got earth, we've got that, but we don't have much. We don't have a lot of natural supplies around here. There's very few farms in, you know, my immediate vicinity. You have to go probably 10 to 20 miles to get into farm country. you're not going to be able to get those locally grown goods without traveling. Right now where I am, I'm, in suburban area. If I needed food or I needed supplies to get them locally, I would have to travel a long ways. And what little resources there are around here are going to have to be stretched. And I live in a county of 750,000 people. 750,000 people in my county. And, there might be, a handful of dairy farms, maybe a handful of, corn farmers and some monoculture farms, but it's not sustainable. We really have a lack of local resources when it comes to food, energy, transportation, manufacturing, everything. We don't make nothing locally. Actually, I think we make like air conditioners, and we got a Lockheed Martin around here that makes radars and stuff like that, but we don't make anything useful. And I really think that's kind of a scary thing. And it worries me a lot because these, you add all these things together that we've talked about, and you have a scenario where when the SHTF event does happen, we live completely unsustainable lives, and your prepping needs to look at that and be able to basically combat all of these things. Do you have a way to get resources? Do you have a way, to supply for yourself? And you need to start looking at that and preparing for that and considering these things when you make your preps. So that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed. I know it was a long one, but these are some kind of things you don't hear about in your normal prepping and SHTF videos. And these are things you really need to think about when you make your plans. Where will I get food? Where will I get water? How will I get to where I gotta go? What's available to me? What's not available to me? And I wish I could say that this video is universal, but it's not. Depending on where you live, you're going to have different resources available to you. If you live out in farm country, food's never going to be an issue for you. If you live in a city, supplies may not be an issue. It's just, you have to look at where you are and the things around you to make your plans and make them work. So, once again, I hope you enjoyed Bushcraft 412.